Late one summer evening, while an entire city trusted the weather forecast and went to sleep, a quiet man and his aging K9 stood alone on high ground, watching the sky change. No warnings, no sirens, just instinct. Hours later, when floodwater and storms tore through the streets below, the place everyone ignored became the only place that held. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Late August in Duluth, Minnesota was not the kind of summer people talked about fondly. The days still carried warmth, but it was a tired warmth, thin and unreliable. By mid-afternoon, the sun no longer promised comfort, only habit. And when evening came, the wind off Lake Superior arrived without warning, cold and sharp, pushing its way through shirts and jackets as if reminding everyone that summer was already losing ground. Most people ignored it. They filled patios, grilled food, laughed louder than necessary, determined to squeeze enjoyment out of the season while it remained. Duluth had always been like that, stubborn, practical, slow to react until reaction was unavoidable. But there were others who noticed the change immediately, people who had learned to pay attention. Graham Holt was one of them. He stood near the old harbor, watching a small crew finish unloading a shipment of lumber. At 40 years old, Graham moved with the quiet economy of someone who wasted no effort. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his frame solid rather than bulky, built by years of military service and physical labor. His posture was upright without being stiff, as though discipline had settled into his bones and stayed there. His face told a restrained story. A square jaw, light stubble that never quite became a beard, and a thin scar running along his right cheekbone, pale against skin darkened by years outdoors. His hair was cut short, dark brown with streaks of gray at the temples. He didn't look tired in the obvious way, but there was a heaviness about him that came from long familiarity with things going wrong. His gray-blue eyes moved constantly, not nervously, but deliberately. He noticed angles, distances, exits. It wasn't a habit he tried to break. It had kept him alive once. At his side was Rook, a retired German Shepherd K9, just under 8 years old. Rook was large and well-muscled, his coat thick and dark, black along the spine and shoulders, deep brown around the legs and face. His ears stood alert, one marked by a small notch from years past. His amber eyes were steady and intelligent, never wandering far from Graham. When Graham stopped, Rook sat. When Graham moved, Rook followed. No commands were needed. They had learned each other in a place where hesitation was dangerous. The job ended without ceremony. Graham accepted a thin envelope of cash, pay for the day, nothing more. He tucked it into his jacket and clipped Rook's leash into place. They headed back toward the part of town where warehouses replaced storefronts and the streets thinned out. On the way, they passed groups of people enjoying the last stretch of summer. Music drifted through open windows, lawn chairs crowded sidewalks. Someone laughed too loudly at a joke Graham didn't hear. He walked through it all without slowing, boots steady, expression unchanged. He didn't resent the noise or the ease. He simply no longer belonged to it. The building where Graham rented a room stood near the edge of the industrial district. It was old, brickwork worn smooth by decades of weather. Inside, the air carried the familiar mix of cleaning chemicals and damp carpet. The owner, Stanley Voss, waited behind the front desk. Stanley was a man in his late 50s, heavy-set, with thinning hair combed carefully to one side. He wore pressed slacks and a polo shirt that never quite fit right. He held a single sheet of paper and avoided meeting Graham's eyes. "Graham," Stanley said, clearing his throat, "I need you to read this." The notice was straightforward. The property had been sold. Tenants were required to vacate within 30 days. No extensions, no negotiations. Graham read it once. He folded the paper neatly and handed it back. "All right," he said. Stanley blinked, clearly expecting more. An argument, a complaint, something that might allow him to justify the discomfort he felt. Instead, he offered a weak apology and nodded. Rook watched Stanley carefully, then turned away, uninterested. Graham's room was small and orderly. A narrow bed against the wall, a battered dresser, a small table with a lamp that flickered when turned on. The only personal touches were practical. Rook's leash hung on a hook. A compact first aid kit sat within easy reach. Graham lived lightly, as though prepared to leave at any moment. He always had been. That night, the wind off the lake rattled the window frame. Graham slept in short stretches, waking at every unfamiliar sound. Years earlier, a sudden noise had sent him scrambling for cover in his own home, heart racing, hands searching for something that wasn't there. Since then, rest had come carefully, never all at once. Rook slept on the floor beside the bed, close enough that Graham could feel his warmth. Without instruction, Rook positioned himself between Graham and the door. It was a habit they both accepted without comment. Morning came clear and bright, the sky deceptively calm. Graham fed Rook, shouldered a small pack, and led him out of the building. Instead of heading toward the job listings or the bus stops, Graham turned uphill. Duluth changed quickly with elevation. Pavement gave way to dirt paths and exposed stone. The sounds of traffic faded, replaced by wind moving through pine branches and the dry crunch of leaves underfoot. The air grew cooler with every step. They climbed steadily, Graham moving at an even pace, Rook alert but relaxed. When they reached a rocky rise overlooking the city, Graham stopped. Below them, Lake Superior stretched wide and flat, reflecting the pale light of the morning. The city lay quiet at its edge, orderly and vulnerable all at once. The wind was stronger here. It pushed against Graham's jacket and tugged at Rook's fur. The ground beneath their feet was dry and solid, well above the neighborhoods clustered near the water. Rook stepped forward, sniffed the air, tested the terrain, then turned back toward Graham. His posture remained calm, waiting. Graham studied the slope above them, a broad patch of stone and packed earth, open and elevated, not sheltered, but stable. He didn't think of it as a home. He thought of it as position, high ground, a place that could not be flooded or quietly taken away. For years, Graham had let circumstances decide where he stood. Orders, jobs, notices taped to doors. This time felt different. He rested a hand on Rook's neck. "Let's go," he said quietly. They climbed higher, leaving the city behind them. The warmth of summer thinned with every step, replaced by something sharper and more honest. Graham did not yet know what he would build or how. He only knew that he would choose this place himself, and that whatever came next, he would not be moved without a fight. The climb the previous morning had not been a decision so much as an instinct, but Graham woke the next day knowing it was no longer just a thought. The image of the rocky slope above the city had stayed with him through the night, steady and uninvited. It wasn't comfort, he remembered. It was position, height, the simple fact that nothing below it could reach up quietly and take it away. By mid-morning, the heat returned, heavy and close, the kind that made sweat form without effort. Graham walked back uphill with Rook at his side, carrying only a canvas pack and a length of rope slung over his shoulder. The city sounds faded again as they crossed into the trees. He moved more slowly this time, stopping often, not to rest, but to look. Graham had learned long ago that speed meant little if you didn't understand the ground beneath you. At the edge of the open stone patch, he stopped. The area was larger than it had looked from below, roughly oval, bordered by scrub pine and low brush. The stone surface was uneven but firm, fractured in wide plates rather than loose gravel. Rainwater would run off instead of pooling. Wind crossed the space cleanly, unobstructed, strong enough to clear smoke, but not so chaotic that it would tear things apart if properly anchored. Rook paced the perimeter, nose low, tail steady. He paused near the northern edge, sniffed deeply, then scratched once at the soil where stone gave way to packed earth. Graham took note. The dog wasn't signaling danger, just information. Animals always noticed what humans overlooked. Graham dropped his pack and sat on a flat slab of rock. He took his time. Years ago, impatience had cost people their lives. He wasn't going to rush now. He wasn't thinking about building a house. He was thinking about shelter in the most basic sense, something that broke the wind, something that shed water, something he could leave without regret and return to without permission, a structure that didn't announce itself as permanent because permanence invited challenge. By early afternoon, the sound of footsteps reached them from the lower trail. Rook's head came up instantly, ears forward. Graham stood, body turning slightly to keep the slope in view. The man who emerged was in his late 30s or early 40s, lean, with narrow shoulders and a sharp nose. His hair was dark and thinning at the front, pulled back into a short, careless tie. He wore hiking boots that had seen little use and a lightweight jacket despite the heat. His beard was uneven, a more neglect than style. He stopped when he saw Graham and Rook, surprise flickering across his face before settling into something guarded. "Didn't expect anyone up here," the man said. "Neither did I," Graham replied. The man smiled faintly. "Name's Caleb Wynn. I work city security. Not today, though." He gestured vaguely at his clothes. "Just walking." Caleb's eyes moved to Rook, lingering there longer than polite. "He retired military?" "Yes." Caleb nodded. "Figures. He stands like one." There was no accusation in his voice, just observation. He shifted his weight, hands loose at his sides. "This area is technically part of the city-managed green zone," he added. "Not many folks come up here." "I'm not many folks," Graham said. Caleb considered that, then shrugged. "Long as you're not dumping trash or starting fires, it's not my concern." He glanced once more around the open ground. "Wind gets nasty up here when the weather turns." "So I've heard." Caleb hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Take care of yourself." He turned and headed back down the trail without another word. Rook watched him go until the man disappeared into the trees. Only then did he relax. Graham exhaled slowly. That exchange told him what he needed to know. The place wasn't hidden, but it wasn't watched either. That mattered. Over the next few days, Graham returned whenever he could. He brought scrap lumber scavenged from the industrial district, weathered but solid. He tested joints, drove stakes, measured distances twice before committing. There was no rush. Each piece had to justify itself. But he started with the simplest thing possible. A low windbreak angled against the prevailing gusts. 2 upright supports anchored into crevices between stones, reinforced with cross-bracing. Nothing tall, nothing dramatic. From a distance, it looked like debris leaned together by accident. Rook stayed close, lying in the shade when the sun grew too strong, rising whenever a sound carried up from below. His presence kept Graham grounded. The dog didn't care about progress. He cared about safety. On the 4th afternoon, Graham noticed someone else approaching, slower this time. The figure was shorter, broader through the shoulders, with a deliberate gait. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she stopped and rested her hands on her hips. "You're the man with the dog," she said. Graham turned. The woman was in her late 60s, perhaps early 70s. She had silver hair cut short and straight, skin weathered but healthy. Her posture was upright despite her age, the kind of stance that came from decades of lifting and leaning over beds. She wore jeans, sturdy shoes, and a plain blue shirt. Her eyes were sharp and direct. "My name's Martha Kincaid," she continued. "I live 2 streets down from the lower trail. I used to be a nurse." Graham nodded. "Graham." She studied the windbreak, then the scattered lumber. "You're not building for comfort," she said. "You're building for staying." "That's the idea," Martha smiled faintly. "People don't like things they don't understand, especially when they look unfinished." She reached into the canvas bag slung over her shoulder and pulled out a small roll of heavy-duty sealing tape and a pair of work gloves. I've got extra supplies in my garage. If you're set on this, you might as well do it right." Graham hesitated only a moment before accepting them. "Thank you." Martha glanced at Rook, who watched her calmly. "Good dog," she said. "Knows his job." "Yes," Graham agreed. When she left, the space felt quieter, but not empty. By the end of the week, the shape of the shelter began to take form, still low, still unobtrusive, but intentional now. Graham worked mostly in the evenings when the heat broke and the wind strengthened. He learned the sound the structure made when stressed, adjusted angles accordingly. He made mistakes, corrected them, and moved on. One night, after the light had thinned and the city below glowed faintly, Graham sat against the stone with Rook beside him. The wind pressed against the barrier and slid away. It wasn't warm, it wasn't comfortable, but it held. For the first time since receiving the notice to leave his room, Graham felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not hope, not relief, something quieter, stability. He rested his hand on Rook's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dog's breathing. Below them, Duluth went on, as it always had, unaware. Graham looked out across the darkening lake and understood one simple truth. This ground, at least for now, was his. The shelter on the ridge did not look like much to anyone passing below. From a distance it blended into the stone and brush, low and angled, as if the wind itself had arranged the boards and left them there. That was exactly how Graham wanted it. He had finished the basic windbreak and roofline by the end of the week, not because he was rushing, but because the weather was beginning to speak more clearly. Late summer in Duluth had a particular tension to it. The heat lingered, heavy and dull, but the lake no longer behaved the same way. The water stayed colder than the air, and that difference mattered. Graham felt it each evening as the wind shifted direction and strength, arriving earlier than it should have, carrying dampness that clung to clothing and skin. He had learned long ago that storms rarely announce themselves honestly. They left clues instead. He came up the trail every afternoon now, his pack heavier each time, scrapboards, a coil of wire, a small shovel. He worked mostly in silence, letting the sound of the wind and the occasional creak of wood guide his hands. Rook stayed close, older now but still tireless in his attention. The dog's movements were slower than they had been years earlier, but no less deliberate. His coat had begun to show gray along the muzzle, and his hips stiffened after long periods of rest, but when something unfamiliar entered the air, his posture sharpened instantly. Graham noticed it one evening when Rook refused to lie down. The dog paced the perimeter of the shelter, nose lifted, tail low but steady. He paused at the eastern edge and sniffed again, longer this time, then looked back at Graham. What is it?" Graham asked quietly. Rook did not answer, but he did not relax either. Graham straightened and scanned the horizon. The sky was clear enough, but the clouds over the lake sat lower than usual, spread flat and wide, as if pressed down by weight. The air felt wrong. Not dangerous yet, but unsettled. He took note and returned to work, adjusting the angle of the roof and tightening the fasteners he had set earlier. The next day, Martha Kincaid arrived again, slower than before, but just as sure of herself. She wore the same practical clothes, her silver hair tucked beneath a cap. She stopped a few steps away and studied the structure without speaking. "You've been listening," she said at last. "To what?" "The wind," she replied. "Most people don't." She handed Graham a small weather radio, its casing scuffed but intact. "Battery still works. Picks up the marine forecast. Lake warnings come early there." Graham accepted it. "Thank you." Martha glanced at Rook, who watched her calmly. "He looks like he knows before anyone else," she said. "He usually does." Before leaving, she paused. "If you start hearing about sudden storms, don't wait. Late summer's when people get careless." After she disappeared down the trail, Graham tested the radio. Static, then a calm voice listing pressure changes and wind speeds. Nothing alarming yet, but it confirmed what his instincts already suspected. Over the following days, small details began to stack. Afternoon heat lingered longer than expected. Nighttime temperatures dropped more sharply. The wind came in bursts instead of steady flow. On the third evening, Graham noticed runoff trickling along a shallow groove in the stone that had been dry since he first arrived. It wasn't much, but it didn't belong there. That same night, he saw movement below on the trail. A man climbed toward the ridge, breathing hard. When he reached the open area, he stopped and wiped sweat from his face. The man introduced himself as Evan Pike, early 30s, thin and long-limbed, with a narrow face and a scruffy beard that looked more neglected than styled. He wore a delivery uniform shirt unbuttoned at the collar and carried an empty thermal bag. His eyes flicked to Rook, then back to Graham. "Didn't know anyone was staying up here," Evan said. "I take this trail to cut time." Graham nodded. "Just passing through?" "Usually." Evan hesitated. "You hear about the storms coming in next week?" "I've heard enough." Evan shrugged. "Dispatch says nothing to worry about. They always do." He smiled without humor. "Anyway, stay safe." He headed back down without further conversation. Rook watched him until he disappeared, then returned to Graham's side. The radio crackled later that evening with an updated forecast. Strong storms forming over the lake, heavy rain possible, high winds. The tone remained calm, almost casual. Graham knew better than to trust tone. He adjusted his plans. The shelter needed better drainage and a secondary anchor. He spent the next 2 days digging shallow channels to guide water away from the base, lining them with stone and scrap metal. He reinforced the roof edge with additional bracing and added a low bench inside to keep supplies off the ground. Rook stayed nearby, resting when he could, rising whenever Graham moved. Despite his age, he remained alert, occasionally lifting his head at distant sounds that Graham could not yet hear. On the 5th evening, as the sun dropped low and the air turned thick, Graham noticed the city lights below flicker briefly, just once, then steady again. He sat on the stone and listened. The wind had gone quiet, not calm, but waiting. The lake beyond the trees lay flat and dark, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. Graham felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, but readiness. He checked his supplies: water, basic food, first aid, extra batteries, everything he needed for a short stay, if necessary. He wasn't planning to move in. He was planning to stay upright. As darkness settled, Rook stood at the edge of the shelter, ears forward, body still. Graham followed his gaze toward the lake. Far off, lightning flickered inside a low cloud bank, silent but persistent. "Not tonight," Graham murmured. "Soon." He lay back against the stone, eyes open, listening to the air. Below them, the city continued its routines, unaware. Above them, the weather gathered itself. Whatever was coming, Graham knew one thing with certainty: this shelter would be tested, and when it was, he intended to be here. The storm did not arrive all at once. It began with pressure, the kind that settled into the air and stayed there, heavy and quiet. By the time Graham woke before dawn, the sky had taken on a dull gray tone that flattened the world below the ridge. The lake was no longer visible as water, only as a wide, dark mass that swallowed light. Rook stood near the edge of the shelter, body angled forward, ears alert, his tail low and still. He had not slept much. Neither had Graham. The radio crackled when Graham turned it on. The voice was calm, measured, but the words carried weight now. Strong storm cells moving in from the lake. Sustained winds. Heavy rainfall expected by late afternoon. Possible power outages in low-lying areas. The phrasing was careful, designed not to alarm. Graham shut it off and exhaled slowly. The time for preparation had passed. Now it was about position. He checked the shelter again, not because he expected to find a flaw, but because routine kept his hands steady. The drainage channels were clear. The anchors held. Supplies were stacked above ground level. Nothing rattled when the wind pressed against the structure. It was not comfortable, but it was sound. By mid-morning, rain began to fall. At first it was light, almost polite, darkening the stone and brushing the air with coolness. Below the ridge, Graham could see movement in the city, cars still traveling, people still going about their day. Summer habits died hard. Rook paced once, then settled near the opening, watching the trail. His muzzle was gray now, more noticeable in the flat light, but his eyes remained sharp. But he lifted his head suddenly and let out a single low bark. Footsteps followed, hurried and uneven. The woman who climbed into view was soaked already, her dark hair plastered against her face. She was in her early 30s, average height, with a strong build that suggested long shifts on her feet. She wore a light jacket clearly not meant for weather like this and carried a small backpack clutched tight to her chest. Her breathing was quick but controlled. "Is this shelter?" she asked. "Yes," Graham said. "Come in." She stepped inside, shaking rain from her sleeves. "Thank you," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "My name's June Parker. I'm a nurse at St. Luke's." June had tired eyes and a face marked by practicality rather than softness. Her hair, dark brown and cut just past her shoulders, June was pulled back loosely, strands already escaping. She moved with purpose, scanning the space instinctively, noting exits and stability. Experience had shaped her, just as it had Graham. "The buses stopped running," she continued. "They said the roads near the lake are flooding already." Graham nodded. "You're safe here for now." June glanced at Rook. "He's calm. That helps." "He knows his job," Graham replied. They sat in silence as the rain intensified. The sound changed from steady tapping to a deeper roar, water hitting stone and running fast. Wind pushed harder now, testing angles. The shelter held. An hour later, Rook stood abruptly. His body stiffened, head turned toward the trail. This time the footsteps were heavier, uneven. A man stumbled into view, half dragging a child. The man was in his 40s, tall but thin, with sharp cheekbones and a dark beard soaked through with rain. His jacket hung open, useless. The boy, maybe 9 years old, clung to his arm, shivering. "Help!" the man said, voice strained. "My car, stalled." Graham moved without hesitation. He guided them inside, positioning them away from the opening. The boy's lips were pale, his skin cold to the touch. "I'm Leo," the boy said faintly. June was already kneeling beside him, assessing. "Mild hypothermia," she said. "We need to warm him slowly." Graham handed her a blanket. He turned to the man. "Sit. Breathe." The man nodded, hands shaking. "I'm Mark Delaney," he said. "I didn't think it would get this bad so fast." "Most people don't," Graham replied. The rain intensified again, sheets of it driving sideways now. The wind howled, striking the shelter with force that made the boards creak but not shift. Water rushed down the channels Graham had carved, flowing away instead of pooling. By early afternoon, the city below began to change. Graham could see flashing lights in the distance, then nothing as power cut out section by section. The streets closest to the lake disappeared beneath moving water. Sirens rose briefly, then faded. Another figure appeared on the trail, then another. 2 college-aged men, soaked and shaken, followed by an older woman moving carefully with a cane. Graham ushered them in one by one, directing where to sit, how to distribute weight. The shelter filled not with panic, but with controlled tension. Rook remained near the opening, alert but calm. Despite his age, he stood watch without wavering, eyes tracking every movement outside. When thunder cracked overhead, he did not flinch. By the time the rain reached its peak, 8 people occupied the shelter, 8 lives pressed together in a space built for 1 man and a dog. The air was close but breathable. Water ran everywhere outside, but inside remained dry. June looked around once, disbelief clear on her face. "How did you know?" "I didn't," Graham said. "I paid attention." The storm raged through the afternoon and into evening. Wind uprooted smaller trees lower on the slope. Somewhere below, something metal tore loose and crashed. The shelter groaned but held. As darkness fell, the rain finally began to ease, not stop, but soften. The wind shifted, losing its sharp edge. One by one, the people inside allowed themselves to breathe. Mark broke the silence. "They'll talk about this tomorrow," he said quietly. "About where people should have gone." Graham said nothing. He added another layer of stone near the drainage and checked the anchors once more. Routine, again, keeping his hand steady. Late that night, distant lights appeared below as emergency vehicles moved cautiously through what remained of the streets. Rook finally lay down, resting his head on his paws, eyes still open. The shelter had done what it was meant to do. It had held. Graham leaned back against the stone and listened to the rain fade into the dark. This was only the first break. He knew that. The weather had tested him lightly, just enough to show what was coming. And now, the shelter was no longer just his. Morning did not arrive cleanly after the storm. It came in fragments, thin light through low cloud, damp air clinging to everything, the ground below the ridge still moving with runoff. Graham woke stiff and alert, his back against the stone, Rook already standing. The shelter smelled of wet fabric and earth, but it was intact. Nothing had shifted in the night. What had been tested had held. The people inside woke quietly. There was no panic left, only the careful silence of those who had survived something together. June Parker checked Leo first, her movements steady, practiced. The boy's color had returned, and his shivering had eased. Mark Delaney sat nearby, shoulders slumped, beard still dripping, eyes rimmed red from exhaustion rather than fear. He nodded once at Graham, gratitude without words. Outside, the city looked altered. From the ridge, Graham could see streets cut by brown water, cars stranded at odd angles, small groups moving carefully along higher ground. The lake remained a flat, dark presence, as if it had spent its anger and now watched. By late morning, voices carried up the trail. Rook signaled before anyone appeared, a low sound in his throat that drew Graham to his feet. 2 figures climbed into view, moving cautiously. The first was Thomas Hale, a man in his mid-50s with a broad chest and a graying beard trimmed close to the jaw. He wore a municipal rain jacket stained with mud and heavy boots. His face was lined, not unkind, but firm, the face of someone used to making decisions under constraint. The second was Lena Ortiz, early 40s, slim, hair pulled into a tight braid, wearing a utility vest over a long-sleeve shirt. Her eyes moved quickly, cataloging details. "We're with emergency services," Hale called out. "You've got people up here?" Graham nodded. 8, Hale exhaled slowly. "We've been trying to reach higher ground all morning. This place stayed dry?" "Yes." Hale stepped closer, testing the edge with his boot. "You build this?" "I did." Lena circled once, crouching to look at the drainage channels, the anchors, the roof angle. "It's simple," she said, "but it's right." "That's the idea," Graham replied. They coordinated the evacuation carefully. One by one, people were guided down the safer section of the trail toward waiting vehicles. June stayed with Leo, Mark close behind. The 2 college students helped the older woman with the cane. Graham went last, Rook moving ahead to check footing. At the base of the ridge, Hale paused. "We'll need to mark this location," he said. "It worked." Graham met his gaze. "It's not a shelter, not officially." Hale nodded. "Noted. Still saved lives." They left without ceremony. By early afternoon, the ridge was quiet again. Graham remained. He wasn't sure why anyone expected him to leave. He spent the next hours repairing small things, tightening fasteners, replacing a board that had warped under pressure, clearing debris from the channels. Work calmed him. Rook lay nearby, resting more than usual now, age finally asking for its due. The dog's muzzle had gone nearly white in the damp light, but his eyes stayed watchful. By evening, footsteps returned, lighter this time. Martha Kincaid appeared at the edge of the clearing, moving slowly but upright as ever. She took in the scene in one sweep. "So it did," she said. "Yes." She stepped inside, touching the stone wall, the bench. "People talk," she added. "They always do after something like this." Graham said nothing. She reached into her bag and set down a small thermos. "Soup," she said. "You'll need it." They sat in silence, sharing the warmth. The wind had eased, but the air remained unsettled, as if more weather were waiting its turn. That night, Graham slept deeper than he had in years, not because the world felt safe, but because he knew where he stood. The following day brought visitors of a different sort. Curiosity climbed the trail along with the sun. A man in his early 30s appeared first, camera slung across his chest, beard neatly trimmed, hair styled despite the mud on his boots. He introduced himself as Aaron Pike, a local freelance reporter. His voice was friendly, his smile quick, but his eyes lingered too long on angles and framing. "Heard about the ridge," Aaron said. "Mind if I ask a few questions?" "I do," Graham replied. Aaron laughed softly, taken aback. "Fair enough. People are saying this place kept them alive." "They're saying things because they were scared." Aaron nodded, still smiling. "Fear makes stories travel faster." He took a photo anyway, from a distance, then left, already speaking into his phone. By afternoon, a small group of hikers arrived, then left. A couple from the neighborhood brought bottled water and left it at the edge without knocking. Word spread without asking permission. Late that evening, Caleb Wynn climbed up again. He looked different now, mud-streaked, jacket torn at the elbow, face drawn. "City's a mess," he said. "Lower roads won't open for days." Graham nodded. Caleb glanced around. "They're going to ask questions about permits, liability." "I figured." Caleb rubbed a hand through his thinning hair. "I told them this wasn't planned, that it wasn't advertised." "That's true," Caleb hesitated. "You're not in trouble. Not yet, but people don't like things they can't categorize." "They can categorize it however they want," Graham said. "It did its job." Caleb nodded once. "I'll tell them that." When he left, darkness followed close behind. The next morning, Graham noticed Rook limping slightly. The dog favored his right hind leg, stiffness settling deeper now that the adrenaline had faded. Graham knelt, examined the joint carefully. Age, weather, nothing more. "Easy," he murmured, resting his forehead briefly against Rook's. But he adjusted their routine. Shorter patrols, more rest. He built a raised sleeping platform for the dog inside the shelter, padded with dry fabric. Rook accepted it without complaint. As the days passed, the city below began to recover in pieces. Power returned in sections. Sirens became less frequent. The ridge remained quiet, but no longer invisible. Graham understood the change. What had been personal had become public. That brought attention. Attention brought pressure. He stood at the edge one evening, looking down at the lights returning to Duluth, thinking not of recognition, but of endurance. Structures didn't fail because they were seen. They failed because they were asked to be something they were not. This place had been built to hold, and whatever came next, Graham intended to make sure it still did. The ridge changed character once the immediate danger passed. What had been quiet and purposeful became observed. Graham noticed it first in the sound of footsteps, more frequent now, more varied. Some came with curiosity, some with gratitude, and some with the cautious authority of people who needed to put names to things. The shelter still stood the same way it always had, low and angled, but it no longer blended into the stone the way it once did. Attention had a way of sharpening edges. Graham adjusted his routine. He worked earlier in the day, rested more often, and kept Rook close. The dog's limp had eased with lighter duty, though the stiffness in his right hind leg remained. Rook was 9 now, his muzzle almost fully gray, his coat still thick but slower to dry in the damp air. He watched the trail with the same seriousness he always had, but he slept longer between alerts, chin resting on the raised platform Graham had built for him. Graham accepted the change without complaint. Experience taught him that pushing past limits only shortened what remained. By midweek, a laminated notice appeared at the lower trailhead. It didn't order anything outright. It requested contact, City Office of Land Management, temporary structures under review. The language was careful, neutral, the kind meant to soften the fact that someone, somewhere, was deciding whether this place would be allowed to exist. Caleb Wynne climbed up that afternoon with the notice folded in his pocket. He looked tired in a way that suggested too many conversations had ended without agreement. His jacket was clean now. Yes, but the crease at the shoulder told Graham he'd slept in it. "They want to talk," Caleb said. "Not shut you down, not yet." "About permits," Graham replied. "And liability," Caleb added. "And precedent," Graham nodded. "Precedent scares people." Caleb managed a thin smile. "Especially when it works." They stood together for a moment, looking out at the city. Duluth was recovering in sections, lights returning block by block, streets clearing, routines reassembling themselves. The ridge remained dry and steady. "They'll send someone up," Caleb said. "Someone official." "Then I'll be here," Graham replied. The official arrived 2 days later, climbing with a measured pace that suggested confidence rather than haste. Sarah Whitcomb introduced herself at the edge of the clearing, extending a hand Graham chose not to take. Not out of disrespect, but habit. She was in her early 50s, average height with a narrow frame and shoulders held straight by long practice. Her hair was a light brown threaded with gray, cut neatly at the jaw. She wore glasses with thin metal frames and a field jacket that had seen use but not wear. Her face carried sharp lines around the mouth and eyes, the marks of someone accustomed to speaking in rooms that resisted her. "Deputy Mayor," she said, voice level. "Thank you for meeting with me." Rook watched her carefully, head lifted, ears forward. Sarah noticed and paused, allowing the moment to pass without comment. "I'm here to understand," she continued, "not to accuse." Graham gestured toward the bench. "Then look." Sarah did. She took her time, moving around the shelter, noting the anchors, the drainage, the low profile. So she crouched once, touched the stone channel, straightened again. "This wasn't built as a statement," she said. "No," Graham replied. "It was built as a response." Sarah nodded. "That's what concerns some people." She explained the city's position plainly. Unpermitted structures created liability. If people were injured, the city could be held responsible. If the shelter encouraged others to build without oversight, the ridge could become unsafe. Her tone remained professional, but Graham heard something else beneath it, a tension between policy and evidence. "You're not asking me to tear it down," Graham said. "Not today," Sarah replied. "I'm asking what you intend to do with it." Graham considered the question carefully. "I intend to keep it what it is, a place that holds when it needs to." Sarah studied him. "And if the city needs to be involved?" "Then it should be," Graham said, "but not at the cost of what makes it work." Rook shifted his weight and settled again. Sarah watched the dog for a moment. "He's old," she said quietly. "Yes." "My father had a K9 after the service," she added. "Didn't trust anyone else. Not really." She straightened. "I don't want to turn this into a monument. I want to turn it into something that doesn't fail." They spoke for another hour. About materials, about access, about clear lines of responsibility. Sarah asked direct questions and accepted direct answers. When she left, she did not promise anything. She did, however, leave without issuing an order. The next days brought a different kind of work. Graham began documenting the shelter, measurements, materials, stress points. But he did not enjoy the process, but he understood its value. He marked improvements that could be made without changing the structure's purpose. Additional signage at the lower trail. A simple inventory of supplies, nothing ornamental. June Parker returned one afternoon, moving more carefully than before, her jacket clean, her expression thoughtful. "The hospital's still patching things together," she said. "People keep asking about the ridge." Graham nodded. "I told them it worked because it wasn't crowded," June added, "because it wasn't advertised." "That's true." She handed him a small bag. Inside were basic medical supplies. "For next time," she said. Graham accepted it. "There will be a next time." She smiled faintly. "There always is." Later that evening, Aaron Pike appeared again, camera absent this time, notebook in hand. When he looked more restrained, his earlier enthusiasm tempered by something closer to respect. "I'm writing a follow-up," Aaron said, "about what happens after." Graham shook his head. "Not interested." "I figured," Aaron replied. "Still thought I'd ask." He left without pushing. That, Graham noted, was progress. As the week closed, the ridge settled into a new rhythm. Fewer visitors, more quiet. The shelter remained unchanged in form, but its role had expanded. Graham felt the weight of that expansion, not as pride, but as responsibility. One night, as the air cooled and the city lights steadied below, Graham sat with Rook beside him. The dog rested his head against Graham's knee, breathing slow and even. "They'll draw lines," Graham said softly. "They always do." Rook did not respond. He did not need to. Graham looked out across the darkened lake and understood that the shelter now stood at an intersection between personal necessity and public need. He did not intend to retreat from either. This place would remain what it was meant to be. Not a symbol, not a spectacle. A structure that held when holding mattered. And Graham would defend that purpose quietly, with the same patience that had built it. The weather did not give Graham much time to adjust to the new attention. 3 days after Sarah Whitcomb's visit, the air shifted once more. It wasn't dramatic. No thunder, no dark wall of clouds rolling in from the lake. Instead, the pressure dropped quietly, the kind of change most people felt only as fatigue or irritability. Graham felt it as a warning. He noticed it in Rook first. The dog had been slower that morning, his steps measured, his breathing heavier than usual after the short walk up the trail. At 9 years old, Rook was still strong, but his endurance was no longer endless. His coat, once quick to dry, held damp longer now, and the stiffness in his hind leg returned when the air grew wet. Still, his instincts remained sharp. He paused often, lifting his head, testing the wind, refusing to settle. You feel it too," Graham said quietly, resting a hand on the dog's shoulder. Rook's ears flicked, but he did not relax. By noon, clouds spread low and wide over Duluth, flattening the light. The lake disappeared again, swallowed by gray. The radio offered cautious updates, localized storms, unpredictable movement, heavy rain possible in bursts, not enough to alarm anyone, enough to be ignored. Below the ridge, life continued. Crews repaired power lines, residents hauled ruined furniture to the curb. The city was busy convincing itself the worst had passed. Graham did not share that confidence. He checked the shelter carefully. The documentation he had started for the city now served a second purpose. He knew exactly where the structure was strongest and where it would fail first if pushed too hard. He tightened 2 anchor points and replaced a length of wire that had begun to fray. He kept movements efficient, conserving energy. Rook lay on his raised platform, eyes open, tracking every sound. By mid-afternoon, the first rain arrived. It came fast and hard, drumming against stone and wood with little warning. Water surged down the slope, filling channels Graham had cleared days earlier. The shelter diverted it cleanly, but the volume was higher than before. Then Rook stood. The sound that reached them was faint at first, shouting, broken by wind and rain. Rook moved to the opening, body angled forward, tension returning to his frame, as if age had loosened its grip for the moment. Graham followed the sound down the slope, careful not to overextend. Visibility was poor, rain streaking sideways. Halfway to the lower trail junction, Doherty spotted movement near a fallen tree. A man struggled there, knee-deep in runoff, gripping the trunk to stay upright. He was tall and broad, late 40s perhaps, with a thick dark beard matted with rain. His jacket hung open, heavy with water. His face was hard, angular, marked by years of physical labor and something heavier, anger, perhaps, or loss. Clinging to his side was a woman, shorter, wrapped in a soaked sweatshirt, her hair plastered to her face. "Don't move!" Graham called. The man looked up sharply, eyes narrowing, assessing threat before help. That reaction told Graham plenty. "My wife slipped," the man said, voice strained. "She can't put weight on her ankle." Graham moved closer, slow and deliberate. "What's your name?" "Victor Shaw." Victor's grip on the tree tightened as Graham approached, then loosened slightly when Rook stepped into view, calm and controlled. "I'm Graham. There's shelter uphill. Dry ground." Victor hesitated, pride warring with necessity. The rain decided for him, surging higher around their legs. "Fine," Victor said, "but I can carry her." "You'll slip," Graham replied. "We'll take it slow." With careful coordination, they moved uphill. Victor carried his wife, Elena Shaw, who bit back pain with clenched teeth. She was in her mid-40s, slender, her face pale but composed. Her eyes stayed alert, focused, refusing panic. At the shelter, Graham guided them inside and set Elena down gently. He assessed the injury, swelling, limited movement, likely a severe sprain or fracture. He stabilized the ankle with what he had. Rook stood nearby, watching Victor closely. "You military?" Victor asked finally. Yes," Victor nodded. "Me too. Long time ago." His voice softened. Something in the storm had cracked open an old door. They sat in tense quiet as the rain intensified again. This storm was narrower than the first, but more aggressive, moving fast and dumping water unevenly. The shelter creaked under gusts, but the anchors held. Graham adjusted weight distribution and redirected runoff with a quick trench extension. Another pair arrived just before dusk, a young woman and an older man. The woman introduced herself as Kayla Monroe, early 20s, slim, with short blonde hair and a scraped knee. She spoke quickly, nerves spilling over. The man beside her, Howard Finch, mid-60s, thin and stooped, moved carefully, saying little. Graham ushered them in, gave Kayla a towel, and seated Howard where the ground was most stable. 6 people now occupied the shelter, including Graham and Rook. Less than last time, but the strain was different. The rain fell harder, the ground beneath them saturated and shifting. As night approached, a sharp crack echoed from below, the sound of earth giving way. A small section of the lower trail collapsed, swallowed by mud and water. "We're stuck," Kayla said, fear finally breaking through. "For now," Graham replied, "but this holds." He was right, but only barely. The rain continued into the night, relentless. Graham remained awake, checking stress points, adjusting supports, listening to the structure speak through creaks and shifts. He felt the limits now, not as abstract calculations, but as physical resistance. Rook stayed on his feet longer than Graham expected, pacing despite the stiffness in his leg. But now when thunder cracked close overhead, he flinched slightly, then steadied himself and returned to position. Graham noticed and made a decision. "Rest," he told the dog, guiding him back to the platform. Rook resisted briefly, then settled, breathing slow but heavy. By early morning, the rain weakened. Not stopped, but softened. The ground stabilized. Light crept back into the sky, pale and uncertain. They waited another hour before moving. When emergency crews finally reached the lower trail, they found Graham already guiding people down carefully, Elena supported between him and Victor. The responders took over quickly. One of them, a young officer with mud-streaked gear, stared back up at the ridge. "That thing's still standing?" he asked. Graham did not answer. When the last of them left, Graham climbed back up alone. Rook followed, limping slightly but determined. At the shelter, Graham sat heavily against the stone. The structure bore new scars, scratches, stress marks, one support slightly twisted but intact. It had held again, but not effortlessly. This time had been different, harder, more personal. Victor's words lingered in his mind. Me too. Long time ago. Graham understood now that this place was no longer simply about weather or ground. It was about people who, like him, had learned to rely on themselves until that stopped being enough. He rested his hand on Rook's head, feeling the warmth beneath wet fur. "This won't be the last test," he said quietly. The shelter did not answer. It did not need to. It had done what it was built to do. Again. The ridge was quiet in the days after the second storm, quieter than Graham expected. Not empty, but settled. The ground had stopped moving beneath his boots, and the channels he had carved carried only thin ribbons of water now, clear instead of brown. The shelter bore the marks of what it had endured: scored wood, a support beam twisted just enough to demand attention, fasteners that needed replacing. But it stood straight. It always had. Graham moved more slowly now, not because of injury, but because he had learned the value of restraint. He spent the first morning after the storm making repairs by hand, measuring twice, removing only what was necessary. He replaced the warped support with a heavier piece of salvaged timber, anchoring it deeper into the stone than before. Each adjustment was deliberate. But he wasn't reinforcing out of fear. He was responding to evidence. Rook stayed close, resting more often, his breathing steady but heavier than it had been a week earlier. At 9 years old, the dog's coat had lost some of its sheen, and his muzzle was fully white now. The stiffness in his hind leg lingered, though it eased once the air dried. He watched Graham work, eyes calm, content to let the man handle what he could no longer patrol endlessly. "You've done enough," Graham told him more than once, guiding him back to the platform. Rook accepted the instruction without protest. Trust worked both ways. By the third day, the visitors returned. Not in a rush, not in panic, but with purpose. Caleb Wynne arrived first, climbing the trail with steady determination. He looked more rested now, his jacket clean, his posture lighter. They've made a decision," he said without preamble. Graham straightened. "Which one?" Caleb smiled briefly. "They want to keep it." Graham waited. "Officially," Caleb continued, "they want to designate this as an emergency refuge point. Limited capacity, no advertising. Minimal footprint." He glanced around. "Pretty much what you've already done." Graham absorbed that in silence. "There will be conditions," Caleb added. "Inspections, a maintenance plan, clear rules." "And ownership?" Caleb hesitated. "That's still being discussed." Later that afternoon, Sarah Whitcomb climbed the ridge again. She looked the same as before, composed, observant, but something in her expression had softened. She walked the perimeter slowly, stopping to examine the replaced support, the deeper anchors, the widened drainage. "You adjusted," she said. I listened," Graham replied. Sarah nodded. "That's why this worked." She met his eyes. "The city won't claim this, not as property. We want to recognize it as a volunteer-built refuge, managed by the person who understands it." "And liability?" Graham asked. "We'll cover it," Sarah said, "as long as it stays what it is." Graham considered that. He thought of the storms, of Victor and Elena, of June kneeling in the rain, of Rook standing watch long past comfort. "I won't turn it into something else," he said. "No signs, no ceremonies." Sarah smiled faintly. "That's acceptable." They finalized nothing that day. They didn't need to. The agreement lived in what had already been proven. In the following weeks, Duluth settled back into itself. The damaged roads reopened. Power returned fully. People resumed routines with the careful optimism of those who had been reminded how fragile routines could be. The ridge, once overlooked, became known without becoming crowded. Word traveled quietly. When weather warnings came, a few people checked the trail. When skies stayed clear, the ridge remained empty. June Parker visited one last time before autumn set in fully. She looked less tired now, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture relaxed. "The hospital asked if I wanted to give a statement," she said. "I declined." "Thank you," Graham replied. She smiled. "I told them some things don't need explaining. They just need maintaining." She glanced at Rook. "How's he doing?" "Slower," Graham said. "Still himself." She nodded. "That's enough." Victor Shaw returned as well. alone this time. His beard was trimmed shorter now, his jacket clean. He moved with more ease, the tension in his shoulders reduced. "Elena's healing," he said. "Says to thank you." Graham nodded. Victor hesitated. "I used to think being ready meant doing everything myself," he said. "Guess I was wrong." Graham didn't argue. The first hard frost came early that year. The ridge woke under a thin layer of white, the stone cold and unforgiving. Graham adjusted the shelter for winter, not expanding it, just tightening what already existed. He added insulation where it mattered and secured the roof edge against snow load. Rook supervised from his platform, eyes half closed, content. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the lake in muted gold, Graham sat at the edge of the shelter with Rook beside him. The city lights below flickered on, steady and ordinary. The radio was silent. No warnings, no alerts. "This is as good as it gets," Graham said quietly. Rook rested his head against Graham's leg, breathing slow and even. Graham thought back to the notice in his rented room, the thin envelope of cash, the instinct that had driven him uphill without a plan. He had not built this place to be seen. He had built it to remain. That it had become useful to others was not intention, but consequence. The shelter did not promise safety. Nothing ever had. It promised only this, that when the ground shifted and the weather turned, there would be a place that did not give way easily. That was enough. As night settled over the ridge, Graham secured the opening and lay back against the stone. Rook settled beside him, close enough to touch. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, no longer threatening, just present. The storms would return someday. He knew that. The city would forget again. That was how cycles worked. But this place would remain, not because it had been declared important, but because it had proven itself when it mattered. And Graham, for the first time in many years, slept without listening for what might take him away. Sometimes, God doesn't send miracles with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes, He sends them quietly, in the form of a man who refuses to walk away, a tired old dog who stays on watch, or a simple shelter built by hands that never stopped believing. This story is not about being famous. It's about being faithful. Faithful when no one is watching. Faithful when you've been overlooked, forgotten, or told you don't matter. The truth is, many of us are living through our own storms right now. Financial worries, loneliness, loss, fear about what comes next, and maybe, like Graham, you don't feel strong. Maybe you feel worn down, tired, or invisible. But Scripture reminds us, God chose what the world considers foolish to shame the wise, and God chose what is weak to shame the strong. What looks small, what looks unimportant, what others walk past without noticing, that is often where God does His greatest work. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to pause for a moment, take a breath, say a quiet prayer for yourself and for those who feel forgotten tonight. Ask God to guide you to higher ground, whatever that looks like in your life. And if you believe even a little that no person or animal should ever face fear alone, please share this story with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to pray with you and for you. And consider subscribing to this channel so we can continue sharing stories of quiet strength, second chances, and the grace that shows up when we least expect it. May God bless you, protect you, and remind you you are not forgotten, and sometimes the miracle is simply that you kept going. Amen.